Hi, welcome to my film theory final presentation on AI and authorship in film. So in this presentation we will talk about the different ways, or some of the different ways, of reading AI authored films through the frameworks of film theory. So the frameworks that we're going to use in this presentation are Auteur theory and death of the author, which are two of the most well-established frameworks to reflect on film, and also, now that these frameworks have been more established historically, to reflect on culture in general. So what is Auteur theory? Auteur theory is an approach to film, and now to other forms of content as well, that claims, or that frames, the director of the film as the author of the film. It's a way of thinking that evolved from the French New Wave, mainly to present film as an art form associated with an authorial intent from a director or from one person. So that could be another artist in the film, but usually the director. And this idea was a framework that was in direct contrast with the idea of Hollywood films, or the Hollywood system, where the studio, rather than an artist with an artistic vision, would have a say over what the final film would look like. At the end of the day, this hasn't particularly aged well as an interpretation, because Hollywood films of the time, some of them have come to be revered as just absolute masterpieces, just as films from the French New Wave, while other films from the French New Wave also have not aged as well. I mean, there's positive and negative sides on either, but that particular association, in contrast with Hollywood, hasn't particularly aged well as an association, although some of what it says is still applicable today. So, what is an auteur in auteur theory? Well, American film critic Andrew Harris proposes three qualities of a filmmaker in order to be a true auteur. So Saris writes that a filmmaker can only be considered a true auteur if he is in the possession of the following attributes of increasing importance: technical competence, a distinguishing personality, and interior meaning within the work. So the question is, do we find these attributes in the films generated by artificial intelligence systems? So the next framework that we're going to use is Death of the Author, which is an approach proposed in 1967 by French theorist Roland Barthes in his essay La mort de l'auteur, published also, I think it was published in English first as The Death of the Author, but it's remembered in academic circles more as La mort de l'auteur, because it's French and it sounds fancy. So in this essay, Barthes argues against the established literary critical practice of incorporating authorial intent in readings, because in his opinion, the intent of the author is actually meaningless, because it just isn't relevant to how the audience reads the work. According to Barthes, to give a text an author is actually imposing limits on the text and on the interpretations that we can give ourselves of the meaning of the text. And it's also limiting because sometimes we just cannot know the authorial intent behind what is being written, what is being shown to us. So, according to readings through Death of the Author, all products of an artist should exist independently of each other. They aren't all under an umbrella of similar themes, they don't have elements of vision that tie them all together. And we should read them for ourselves through our own readings, independent of what the author's vision may have been and the author's intent may have been to communicate to us, because at the end of the day, that doesn't necessarily in practice affect the way that we will read it. So now we get to our AI test subject in the context of this presentation. Our AI test subject is an AI filmmaker whose name well, not its official name, but the name that it goes by in most interviews and in most reports about the AI filmmaker is Benjamin. And so Benjamin is a long short-term memory recurrent neural network, which is a type of machine learning AI agent. So what does long short-term memory recurrent neural network mean, right? It's a bit of a mouthful. Essentially, it just means that it's a short-term memory network. So it doesn't have the things that it processes don't get saved into long-term memory. So it works entirely with RAM. However, the amount of memory that it uses at a time, or that it can use at a time for one thread of process, is long. It's a lot of memory. And so it's a type of neural network that has shown itself to be quite good at natural language processing. So it's actually the type of AI that's used in smartphone predictive text software. And so this particular iteration of long short-term memory recurrent neural networks, Benjamin, was built by a researcher whose name is Ross Goodwin. And it was used to produce 3 different films. So at the time of recording of this presentation, Benjamin's films are Sunspring, released in 2016, starring Thomas Middleditch; It's No Game, released in 2017, starring David Hasselhoff; and Zone Out, released in 2018, also starring Thomas Middleditch. In the context of this presentation, Benjamin's first 2 films aren't particularly interesting to us because Benjamin's role in the production of those 2 films is actually quite limited. So in Sunspring, Benjamin was tasked with generating the screenplay for the film, which then was produced by other humans. And then in It's No Game, the artificial intelligence actually had even less of an influence because it was only tasked with generating some parts of the script, including David Hasselhoff's lines. In Zone Out, actually, however, the situation's completely changed, and Benjamin is actually tasked with not only generating the screenplay, but also editing the film and doing the special effects of the film, which are actually and the special effects in Zone Out are actually mainly like fades and deep faking the faces of Thomas Middleditch and the other actors in the film, on top of actors from not Creative Commons. Now the word has escaped me. Yes, right, from films from the public domain. So essentially, in Zone Out, Benjamin, the artificial intelligence agent, had complete control over the entire production pipeline of the film, and direct involvement in every aspect of that pipeline, from the writing to the editing to the production, etc., etc., and the choosing of shots. Though it didn't film its own scenes, it chose scenes from open films. So now we get to the question of whether or not Benjamin, the artificial intelligence, is an auteur. What does a reading of Benjamin through auteur theory have to say? Certainly, all of Benjamin's films have a distinct style and preoccupation, although that is not necessarily saying much because that style is sort of gobbledygook, right? It's clear from all of Benjamin's films that there is pattern recognition in Benjamin's work that is producing content that looks a lot like the styles of film that it is emulating, but at the same time it still doesn't make sense to other human being, to a human audience. So it certainly still ticks the box of having a distinct style and preoccupation throughout the director's body of work, if we consider that Benjamin is indeed the director as it is claimed by its creator. Then yes, So what about through Sarris's criteria for the auteur in auteur theory? So technical competence, right? The only film that we really have to evaluate this criteria is Zone Out, and I don't think that we can give a direct yes or no response to yes, this artificial intelligence system does have technical competence, or no, it doesn't. Because the fact is that if you give any piece of software, even something that is hard-coded, where you just give it direct instructions on what to do with the appropriate interface to edit video or to paste images on specific places in the video, or to write words in a specific order, then code that doesn't have any kind of machine learning properties can do that. But it has to have all of the step-by-step instructions from a human being that then are hard-coded into the code. So, but what's interesting with machine learning is that the style of editing, the approach to script writing, the approach to how even the deep faking of the characters is done, where the faces are deep faked, etc., etc. All of that is something that is learnt by the machine when it is given a prompt, and that prompt is usually, do X and find out how to do X until we think that you do a good enough job. So there is definitely technical competence in doing the tasks that it is being told to do, but at the same time, human criteria of, what we usually expect of editing, what we usually expect of film production, it doesn't quite manage to fool anyone into believing that the film is made by a human being or by human beings. So I think the answer is a bit ambiguous on that one. Then the next criteria is a distinguishing personality. Again, I think this really fits with the distinct style and preoccupation, and I think that I'm inclined to say that Benjamin does have a distinguishing personality, but Benjamin is also not a conscious entity, and it's very dangerous to humanize it, because it is essentially just a set of simulated neurons, which essentially are just boxes that hold certain values that are connected to other boxes that hold certain values that are connected to other boxes that hold certain values, and they all sum up together in a final node that gives a result and that outputs that result. So it doesn't have any form of consciousness, but it does have the ability to learn from data sets and from training. And what it produces, even though the entity itself does not have a personality, is something where the content itself, I think, has personality through the sort of the distinct style and general sort of gobbledygook approach, which is a recognizable form of gobbledygook. It's not a different form of nonsense every time. It's the same form of nonsense every time. So I'm inclined to say yes, but again, because of the fact that this is an entity that isn't conscious, people might disagree with me on the distinguishing personality. And the final criteria is interior meaning within the work. And I think this is probably the most interesting one for me, because actually, yes and no, right? It's been trained on the AI has been trained on a data set, and it's been trained to do a specific thing. So there is a meaning in the work, in the sense that the work is being generated from instructions from an understanding of the data set that the neural network has. On the other hand, it doesn't have any kind of meaning to us, and there's no way for us to interpret that meaning, because it's just not human language. There are people who speak in the film, and they speak English words, but it's pattern recognition according to a language that is low-level machine code, and we aren't actually able to perceive that and to make sense of that. So we don't understand the rationale behind the meaning within the work, but there probably is one, even though, and this is where I think that this is still subject to debate, the neural network isn't actually conscious, so it isn't conscious of the meaning that it's producing. So before we get to whether Benjamin can or cannot be read as an auteur of Zone Out and its other films, I just want to get into a reading of Benjamin through Death of the Author. So can we apply Death of the Author to Benjamin's work? Well, in a sense, yes and no, and I'm going to focus mainly on Zone Out here because it's the one that's most completely directed, let's say, by the Benjamin artificial intelligence agent. But essentially, on the one hand, our interpretation of Zone Out can only be distinct from the intent of the author, because we do not have access to it, and we don't have, even if we had access to it, we wouldn't have a way of actually understanding the intent behind it. On the other hand, the intent of the artificial neural network in this case really is the key to understanding the content, because the intent is the content, and the content is a direct manifestation of the intent of the neural network, because the content is directly produced by that one entity, rather than in most cases where film is usually a collaborative effort. And in some sense, Zone Out is also still a little bit of a collaborative effort because it's using films from the public domain that were produced in a collaborative way by Hollywood studios, etc., etc. But I would think that that's a little bit of a stretch, because the way that it's editing it is essentially producing its own supercut with special effects added on top, with specific transitions, with a specific script, completely changing the story completely. So it is using content that is existing to generate new content, but that content itself is produced directly from the meaning and associations that the AI has for the work. So in that sense, the meaning, the intent of the auteur, if we can consider Benjamin to be an auteur, is the key to understanding the work, and unfortunately we don't have that. And on the other hand, we cannot even ever access that key. So we have no choice to act with Death of the Author in mind and read the content for ourselves, read Zone Out as a sort of absurd black and white drama that just doesn't really make sense and is sort of surreal by virtue of nothing. It does not necessarily have to have an origin. So in conclusion about these two different ways of approaching Benjamin's films, is Benjamin an author, and what does that say? And also, how can a Death of the Author reading of Benjamin's work inform us? So to respond to these questions, I'm going to address it this way. I think Benjamin is a great example of an auteur if we're willing to read it as an agent with authorial vision, which is the case. It has authorial vision that through the data set that it's trained on. But this vision is imposed directly by factors external to its control. But then again, we could say the same about humans, just with extra steps. We are the content that we produce, the processes that our minds go through, etc., all of our reflection are the sum of all of our external factors, all of the social factors that we live in, all of the physical conditions that we're put in, etc., etc. So make of that what you will. I think at the same time, Benjamin is simultaneously a great example of Death of the Author and not a great example of Death of the Author, because its intents and motivations aren't decipherable through its films, and we read its films as absurd romps, or without motivation in some sense, the motivation of the artificial intelligence is irrelevant to our reading because it's inaccessible in the first place. But at the same time, Benjamin raises questions about auteur theory and death of the author. About auteur theory, if Benjamin has a vision, a technique, an interior meaning, what is it? It seems like it does, but what is it? What might that look like if we were able to translate that into something that us as humans, we would be able to understand? And about death of the author, Benjamin could actually be a good argument against death of the author because the neural network's authorial vision in Zone Out is so directly tied to the film end product that the film might be argued the film without the authorial intent might not actually exist and might not actually ever be able to be understood. So this was my presentation. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'm sorry for it being a little bit late. And so heading out, this is the bibliography of sources that I have referenced throughout this presentation. Ciao.